They say the Vikings feared nothing, not the sea which could swallow men whole, not the sword which cut down friend and foe alike, not even death, for to die with a weapon in hand was to be chosen for glory. And yet, there was one story that stilled their laughter, that dimmed their songs, that made even the bravest warrior fall silent by the fire. A story not of battles won or lost, but of an ending no blade could stop. On long winter nights, when snow piled against the doors and the wind howled like wolves outside, families gathered close in the warmth of the longhouse. Smoke curled from the fire pit, casting shadows across carved beams. Children pressed close to their mothers, and warriors leaned on their shields, their eyes fixed on the storyteller. It was in such moments that the tale of Ragnarök was spoken, not shouted, not sung with triumph, but whispered like a secret carried on the wind. For this was the tale that promised no mercy, no escape. The gods themselves, mighty Odin, thunderous Thor, even cunning Loki, would not survive what was to come. The world would freeze, then burn. Monsters would rise, bonds would shatter, and even the heavens would fall. The Vikings called it Ragnarök, the fate of the gods. And though it was said to belong to the far future, its shadow touched every life, because this story was not about if, it was about when, and that is why it lingered, not just in the halls, not just in the sagas, but in the hearts of all who listened long after the fire turned to ash. The land of the Vikings was not kind. It was a place carved by ice and fire, where the earth itself seemed to test those who dared to live upon it. In the north, winters stretched endlessly, as though the sun itself had abandoned the people. For months the sky hung heavy and dark. The rivers froze, the seas turned to black steel, and the wind tore across the fjords with a voice like 1,000 screaming spirits. Inside the longhouses, men and women huddled together, feeding the fire with what little wood they had, praying it would last the night. Food was always a question. The soil was rocky, thin, stubborn. Fields gave little, and what they gave could be taken by frost, by storm, or by raiders who came with axes and torches. Hunger gnawed at the belly as constantly as wolves howled in the forests. Every winter was a gamble. Would the grain hold out? Would the animals survive? Would the youngest children see the spring? And yet the sea was harsher still. It was both a giver of life and a taker of it. The longships that carried Vikings across the world were marvels of craft, but they were only wood and cloth, fragile things against the rage of storms. A wave taller than a hall could smash a ship to pieces, dragging oarsmen down into the endless dark. Many left their villages chasing silver, fame, or land, only never to return. The sea kept its secrets well. The forests, too, whispered danger. Bears and wolves stalked the edges of fields. In the shadows of the pines, people said spirits walked, shapes older than men, older even than the gods. The mountains loomed above, jagged and cold, their peaks hidden in mist. Lightning split the sky, thunder cracked against stone, and the people said, "Thor is here. He watches. He protects us." It was in this world of constant struggle that the legends were born. For the Vikings, the sagas were not mere stories. They were explanations, attempts to understand the chaos that surrounded them. Why the storms came, why hunger never left, why life seemed to hang by a thread. When thunder shook the sky, they spoke of Thor's hammer striking. When the sea boiled, they told of Jormungandr, the great serpent, shifting in the depths. When the wolves howled at the moon, they whispered of the two hunters, Skjöll and Hati, chasing sun and moon across the heavens. But there was one story that tied them all together. One story that gave meaning to every hardship, every loss, every shadow. It was not a story of comfort. It was not meant to soothe the heart. It was meant to remind that one day all of it, the land, the sea, the forests, even the gods, would end. The people could fight hunger and sometimes win. They could challenge the sea and sometimes return. They could raise walls against raiders, draw swords against rivals, and feel the thrill of victory. But against Ragnarök, against the end of everything, there was no victory to be had. And so on the coldest nights, when families huddled close and the winds pressed hard against the walls, the skalds would tell the tale. The words drifted like smoke into the rafters, heavy, inevitable. Men who had faced death in battle without blinking would fall silent. Mothers would hold their children tighter, and the fire itself seemed to burn lower, as though it too knew the end was coming. For the legend of Ragnarök was not born of comfort, but of truth. The truth of a people who lived with death at every door, and who understood more deeply than most that nothing, no man, no beast, Not even the gods themselves could stand against time. It was in their world, their struggles, their endless fight against cold, hunger and storm that Ragnarök took root, not as a dream, not as a nightmare, but as a prophecy. And as the flames cracked and the wind moaned outside, the tale would begin. The end was coming, and nothing could stop it. The skald's voice grew softer as the logs in the hearth sank lower, pulling everyone closer to the glow. He did not rush. There was a patience to his telling, as if each word were a careful step across a frozen river. And so the vision began, not as a single blow but as a slow unraveling, one scene at a time, each more certain than the last. It began with a quiet unlike any other. Not peace, but a hush that screamed of something wrong. The birds fell silent. Dogs stopped barking. Even the sea seemed to hold its breath. The sun grew thin, as if a hand pressed against it from the other side. Farmers looked up from their fields and felt the air thicken, the sky leaning in. The skald named this hush Fimbulwinter, a winter that would not end. 3 years of snow, he said, and with each day the world would grow colder in both body and spirit. At first it was only hunger and frost. Grain rotted beneath frost-hardened soil. Animals dwindled. Families rationed mead and bread by the flicker of a single flame. But the winter did more than take food. It broke the cords that bound people together. Long-standing feuds flared into slaughter. Brothers who had once shared bread turned their hands to blood. In the tales, the hearths that once warmed communities grew empty. Voices that had sung of weddings and war fell into whispers of betrayal. While men destroyed one another, other things stirred awake. From the deep places of the world, waters black and fathomless, something moved. The great serpent of the sea, Jörmungandr, shifted in his coils. He had lain for ages, wound about the earth, but in those days the ocean itself rose at his anger. Waves became fists, harbors emptied as the serpent rolled and spat venom that blackened the waters and fouled the sky. Fishermen who had long prayed for gentle tides found their nets shredded and their oars slick with a poison that tasted like iron and salt. Far to the east, in lands of ice and iron, other beasts stirred. Fenrir, the wolf bound by unbreakable fetters, felt the copper bite of chains loosen. The great ropes woven with spells and the names of gods frayed like old rope in a storm. His eyes, at times described as embers, opened. He sniffed the air and howled, a sound the skald compared to the tearing of the world's seams. The chains snapped. There was no triumphant howl in the hall when the skald spoke it, only a slow, cold certainty. The wolf was free, and then the sky itself turned traitor. 2 hounds older than time chased the sun and moon. Their names were Skirl and Hati, and in the telling they were tireless. The chase that had always been part of the sky's music came to its end. Skirl leapt and swallowed the sun like a bowl scooped from a table. Hati caught and tore the moon. Day became a memory, and the heavens folded into shadow. From below the dead began to stir. Hell, pale and stern, opened the gates of her cold hall and mustered those who had died of sickness, of old age, of battle. They came forth not as ancestors with warm memories, but as ranks given over to something else, an echo of life without breath. Their march had no drum but the echo of their footfalls on earth, and when it reached the villages, the dogs would go quiet, and even the embers would dim as if afraid. In Asgard, the gods felt the change. Odin, who sought knowledge even at a terrible cost, sat on his throne and listened to the threads of fate. He had read runes and heard prophecies before, but this thread ran through him as if through bone. Warriors of Valhalla sharpened spears. The Valkyries winged across cold skies. Thor lifted Mjolnir and felt the world answering with a distant rumble, not wholly foreign to his hammer, yet different, older, deep, and inexorable. The skald did not rush when he spoke of the assembling. Names were not shouted. They were spoken slow with the weight of memory. The plain of Vigrid spread out in the telling like a map unfurling, endless, hard-packed, the ground itself expecting the tread of armies. From the corners of the 9 realms, from frost and flame, from sea and shadow they came. Gods in gleaming mail, giants with eyes like white stones, monsters smelling of salt and rot. No single moment alone changed the world. The skald painted the end as a pattern, 1,000 small collapses folding into one, the soft sound of a child's laughter unheard. The axe that once fell to cut wood now fell to cut a throat. Oaths that unmade alliances. The gods answered as gods do, by meeting to meet fate head-on. Odin rode forth on Sleipnir, his one-eyed glance full of long knowledge. Thor strode with hammer in hand, feeling the pull of the serpent in his knees. Even Loki, mischief's own, moved with a gravity that was oddly resolute, for fate would not be cheated by trickery alone. The battles were not merely between champions, they were collisions of worlds. The serpent writhed and spilled poison that caused the oceans to foam like the mouths of wolves. Fenrir leapt and ground the earth under his paws, his breath a gale that toppled shields. The dead, a tide of grey, met the living in a soundless shock that nonetheless cracked the marrow of Midgard. Lightning and flame, ice and rot, elements themselves turned to arms and struck. The skald spoke of the last blows as if they were the closing of an old book. Odin met Fenrir, spear against tooth, and the wolf's maw closed upon the All-Father. Thor struck the serpent and crushed it. He walked 9 steps under the weight of triumph and fell, poisoned by his own victory. Heimdall and Loki, bound by years of enmity and brotherhood, met and struck each other until neither stood. The world tree Yggdrasil shuddered and bled sap like the wound of an ancient beast. The sky cracked, and from the rift a heat like a furnace poured. Surtur, the fire giant, sweeping his sword of flame across the lands. Surtur's blaze was not a single fire, but a tide of amber that turned stone to glass and bone to ash. It ate through the plains, over Asgard's walls, across Midgard until the seas themselves boiled and the roots of the world trembled. The skald did not describe screams so much as a falling stillness, the cessation of music, of the creak of ship timbers, of the clink of chainmail. Sound itself seemed to bend towards silence. Yet even as he spoke of ruin, his voice found a softer note, a small, stubborn thing. From the ash and the salt a handful would remain, and in the hush that followed the conflagration, green would take its first breath again. The tale closed in the telling, not with a finality like a slammed door, but with the hush of someone waiting to see what might come next from beneath the cinders. As the skald finished, the hall sat in a kind of stunned quiet. The embers glowed, and the listeners felt the vision settle into their bones. The prophecy had been unrolled step by step, an unkind clockwork of seasons and monsters and fate. It was not simply a warning. It was an inheritance. The end had been shown, and in knowing it, each heart held a small, sharp thing. How then to live if the end was known? Outside, the wind picked up and rattled the rafters as if answering. Inside, someone shifted and the fire sighed. The skald's eyes met those of his listeners one by one, and in them, in the small bright reflections in bearded faces and wide child eyes, the story glowed on. An ember passed from hand to hand until, like embers, it would be carried into dreams, for the Vikings did not fear death. To fall with steel in hand was no sorrow. It was a passage. The bravest of the slain would be lifted by Valkyries to the golden halls of Valhalla, where Odin's chosen feasted and fought forever. Others might rest in Freya's field, or in Hel's cold but steady realm. There was always a place beyond, always a promise that one's name would not vanish with the body. Death was no thief. It was a road, but Ragnarök was different. Ragnarök said there would be no hall, no song, no promise. Not even the gods, who stood taller than men and bore the weight of the skies, would endure. Odin himself, the All-Father, would fall into the jaws of the wolf. Thor, strongest of all, would crush the serpent, but stumble poisoned into death. Loki, Heimdall, Freyr, all gone. If the gods could not outlast fate, what chance had any man? The firelight trembled as the skald spoke, and in the silence around him men sat with their hands folded tight upon their knees. For here was the truest terror, not of pain, nor of the axe, nor of the sea's cold grasp. It was the terror of futility, the terror that no courage could change the ending, no song could outlive the silence. To a Viking there was no greater joy than the clash of steel, no greater virtue than courage. A man might lose his farm, his ship, even his life, but if he faced it boldly, he left behind honor. His kin would sing of him. His name would endure. That was the measure of meaning. But Ragnarök stripped meaning away. It promised a battle where even the greatest warriors would fight only to fall, where shields would splinter, spears would shatter, and still the end would come. To know of such a battle was to taste a fear beyond fear, the fear that glory itself would burn with the rest of the world. That was why, when the skald's voice sank into the embers, no man laughed to break the heaviness. That was why mothers drew their children closer, why warriors stared into the fire as if trying to see through it. Because Ragnarök was not just a tale of gods and monsters, it was a reminder whispered into every ear. All things end, and though the world outside the longhouse carried on, snow falling, wolves howling, the sea breathing against the shore, that truth lingered. Heavy as iron, the end would come, and even the brave could not stop it. The plain of Vigrid stretched as far as sight could see, vast and desolate, a battlefield chosen by fate itself. There, in the shadow of a sky on fire, the hosts gathered. On one side, the gods of Asgard, armored in gold and grim resolve. On the other, the creatures of chaos, the wolf Fenrir with eyes like burning coals, the Midgard Serpent thrashing its coils across the sea, fire giants led by Surtur, whose sword blazed brighter than the sun. Odin rode first, his spear Gungnir in hand, ravens wheeling overhead. He knew he rode to death, yet still he came, for the All-Father could not shrink from his doom. Thor marched beside him, thunder in his breath and Mjolnir shining in his grip. Freya, stripped of his sword, bore only an antler but stood unflinching. Heimdall lifted his horn Gjallarhorn once more, its echo shaking heaven and earth. Then the clash began. The ground split beneath Fenrir's weight as he leapt, jaws wide enough to devour the sky. Odin met him fearless, but the wolf's power was too great, and in one final snap of those monstrous teeth the All-Father fell. A cry went up from the gods, but no hand could turn back fate. Thor, in fury, hurled himself at Jörmungandr, the world serpent. Their battle shook the seas and skies. At last Mjolnir crushed the serpent's skull, but Thor staggered, poisoned by its venom. He walked but 9 steps before he too collapsed, dead upon the plain. One by one the gods met their fates. Freya fell to Surtur's blazing sword. Loki and Heimdall struck each other down, each piercing the other's heart. Blood and fire mingled, and the world seemed to tremble on the edge of ruin. And then came Surtur's final stroke. He raised his flaming sword high, and with a roar he brought it down. Fire swept across the 9 worlds, devouring land and sky alike. Mountains melted, oceans boiled, stars were snuffed from the heavens. The great tree Yggdrasil itself shuddered and cracked as the inferno claimed it. Thus ended the age of gods. Thus ended all things. The hall fell silent. Only the crackling fire remained, echoing the roar of Surtur's flame. But from silence something stirs. The fire dies, smoke curling into the dark. The seas cool, the land lies in ash, yet from the wreckage a new world slowly rises. Green shoots push through blackened soil. Rivers run clear again, their waters cold and fresh. The sky, once torn apart, grows bright with sun and stars reborn. 2 humans, hidden away during the chaos, step into this new dawn. They are Lif and Lifthrasir, life and lover of life, and from them humankind will begin again. Yet though the world is reborn, it is not the same. The halls of the gods stand empty. The seats of Odin, Thor, Freyr, and the rest remain vacant. A world without its protectors, without its great powers, lies open to the hands of men. This is why the tale lingered so deeply in Viking hearts. For even in its ending it whispered both terror and hope. The terror that even gods may die. The hope that life endures, that something new can rise from the ashes. And so, as the fire in the hall burns low, the Skald's voice softens. He leaves his listeners with not only the dread of doom, but the weight of wonder. Perhaps Ragnarök was not just an ending, but a reminder that life, fragile though it may be, has the strength to outlast even the end of the world. The flames flicker, shadows fade. The hall grows quiet, and still the story lingers in the silence after the fire.